Good morning. The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on the Muslim community's response to this committee's hearings on radicalization in the United States. The Chair wishes to remind our guests today that demonstrations from the audience, including the use of signs and placards as well as verbal outbursts, are a violation of the rules of the House. The Chair wishes to thank our guests for their cooperation in maintaining order and proper decorum. This time I recognize myself for an opening statement. 15 months ago, this committee, the Homeland Security Committee, which was formed in the wake of the tragic attacks of September 11th, held the first in a series of hearings into radicalization of the Muslim American community. The necessity for these hearings was obvious, and there should have been bipartisan support. Attorney General Holder, for instance, had stated in a major media interview that a crisis of radicalization to violence had arisen within the Muslim American community. The Attorney General said what kept him awake at night were 126 cases of homegrown terrorism since 2009, 90% of which involved American citizens or residents in contact with or inspired by al-Qaeda, who plotted to kill other Americans in mass casualty terror attacks. That kept me awake at night, too. Yet from the moment I announced the hearings, I was attacked by politically correct special interests and their unthinking allies in the media, led by the New York Times. More than 1,000 protesters come out in the rain to rally against me in Times Square the Sunday before the first hearing. And even Kim Kardashian found time in her busy schedule to note her objection to the hearing. Of course, none of the nightmare scenarios anticipated by the media ever occurred. No religious war broke out. Not one bigoted word was uttered during the 4 investigative hearings we held, including the first ever joint hearing with the Senate Homeland Security Committee. What we did do was force into the open the long overdue national debate on Muslim American radicalization. And here's what our committee's investigations and hearings have put on the public record so far. We heard expert testimony by 4 former top law enforcement officials, 4 activists in the Muslim American community, 3 relatives of terrorists or terror victims, and 3 senior military officials. Many were new voices who were given a platform by the hearings. The investigation and witnesses reveal that, 1, the threat posed by radicalized Muslim Americans is a clear and present danger to Homeland Security. Videos, internet, and face-to-face radicalization and recruiting by al-Qaeda and its affiliates inside our homeland emerged over the past 3 years, due in large part to our success in attacking al-Qaeda overseas. Radicalization in prisons has often been unchecked and aided by what the committee learned were over 70 tapes in U.S. Federal Bureau of Prisons inmate libraries by American citizen and AQAP leader Anwar al-Awlaki, who was later killed in Yemen. The most successful radicalization and recruitment effort by an al-Qaeda affiliate was Somalia's al-Shabaab group, which signed up upwards of 50 American citizens for violent jihad. Homegrown terrorist target of choice has increasingly been U.S. military communities inside the homeland. And the number of military insiders suspected of being radicalized to violent Islamist extremism is a still classified but truly dangerous amount of ongoing cases. Our investigation compelled elected officials, the government, and the media to confront an issue that is politically volatile and politically correct. Some elements, of course, refuse to accept reality or engage in honest debate. For instance, it was the media who almost 11 years ago had demanded to know why 9/11 was allowed to happen, and demanded that Congress take steps to ensure that we never again underestimated an enemy in our midst. This committee was formed for that purpose. When I became chairman again last year, I saw a clear constitutional duty to ask tough questions about counterterrorism, and our investigative hearings show that the mainstream media doesn't always get it right, nor is it consistent. For example, the New York Times, besides attacking me, is now focusing its venom on the New York City Police Department for its focus on the Muslim American community, despite the fact that New York is the #1 Islamist terrorist target in the country, and the NYPD has prevented numerous attacks, up to 14 attacks. In 1993, following the first World Trade Center attack, the Times blamed law enforcement for not doing enough against what they labeled as, quote, mysterious Muslims, unquote, operating out of New Jersey, led by the blind Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman. At that time, the Times said, quote, closer monitoring of the Sheikh may not necessarily have prevented the bombing, but it might have. If incidents like the Trade Center bombing can't be completely prevented, they can and should be made extremely rare. Well, that is exactly what this committee has been doing, confronting in open hearings the uncomfortable truth about the current terror threat. I lost more than 150 neighbors, friends, and constituents on September 11th, and I never wanted on my conscience that I didn't do all that I could to prevent another attack or that I caved into political correctness. The overwhelming majority of Muslim Americans are outstanding Americans, yet the reality is that the Islamist terror threat comes from that community. And as a recent Pew poll demonstrated, 16% of Muslim Americans have a favorable or only a somewhat unfavorable view of al-Qaeda. That adds up to almost 440,000 people who are living in this country. Also, part of a Pew poll showed that 5% of Muslim Americans actually have a favorable view of al-Qaeda, and that would come to more than 150,000 Americans who are living in this country. That is why we have held a series of hearings and why we will not back down. That's also why I look forward to the testimony of the Muslim American witnesses who are here today to testify on the impact which those hearings have had within their community. I applaud them for their courage, and I look forward to hearing their insights. And with that, I yield to the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Today's hearing is the fifth hearing in this committee's series on radicalization in the American Muslim community. Since the committee's first hearing on radicalization, the Obama administration has taken several steps in dismantling al-Qaeda's operations abroad. Osama bin Laden, Anwar al-Awlaki, Samir Khan, all have been killed. In essence, the world has changed. But despite a changing world, which requires us to look forward, this committee seems to want to look back. We are holding today's hearing to discuss the effects of previous hearings. I'm not sure we've ever had a hearing to gauge the effects of prior hearings. Given the challenges the nation faces in Homeland Security, the ongoing problems at TSA, the ability of FEMA to meet the needs of disaster survivors, the effect of budget cuts on research and development within science and technology, just to name a few, I'm not sure that a hearing to gauge the effects of our hearings is the most effective use of congressional time and attention. But this is not the first time I've questioned the premise of this series of hearings. Prior to the first hearing, I wrote the chairman to request that the coverage of the hearings be expanded to broaden our inquiry into radicalization. I noted that there were domestic groups that may constitute a threat because of linkages between extreme ideology and a willingness to take violent action. My request was turned down. As we meet to once again hear testimony about Muslim radicalization, I'm pretty sure I know what will be said. I'm sure that the witnesses will testify that these hearings have helped Muslims come forward. However, in reality, there was never a problem with Muslims coming forward. As noted by Attorney General Holder, the cooperation of Muslim and Arab American communities has absolutely been essential in identifying and preventing terrorist threats. As further emphasized by Michael Leitner, Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, many of our tips to uncover active terrorist plots in the United States have come from the Muslim community. So we have to make quite clear that the communities are part of the solution and not part of the problem. These statements from law enforcement officials and terrorism experts support the notion that Muslim American community is not afraid to come forward and has been coming forward to provide tips to police, prevent radicalization, and fight terrorism. In short, cooperation of the Muslim American community occurred long before these hearings began. So as we consider the effects of these hearings have had, I need to be clear about what I hope the effects have been. I hope that the hearings did not perpetuate the notion that the United States is at war with Islam. Such a notion would only help the recruitment efforts of al-Qaeda and similar groups. John Brennan, the President's chief counterterrorism advisor, has noted that describing our enemy in religious terms lends credence to al-Qaeda's propaganda. Although the hearings were narrowly focused on Muslims, I hope they did not have that effect. I hope these hearings did not encourage a belief among Americans that the fellow citizens are inherently dangerous because of religious affiliation. I know there have been many times in this country's history when those in power have decided that some people are inherently dangerous. Once that determination has been made, public officials feel justified in infringing on constitutionally protected rights. About a week ago, a group of Muslim Americans filed suit against the New York Police Department for infringing on the speech, religion, assembly, and due process rights of Muslim Americans. I hope these hearings did not help provide a congressional stamp of approval for groups that espouse anti-Muslim beliefs. As noted in a report by the Center for American Progress, witnesses at these hearings often repeated myths that originated in anti-Muslim think tanks. But most of all, I hope these hearings did not increase the number of hate crimes against Muslims. According to the FBI in 2012, hate crimes against Muslims rose nearly 50% in the United States. Although the statistics have not been released for 2011, the years these hearings started, I hope we do not see an increase. Mr. Chairman, the actions of this committee did not create an anti-Muslim attitude in this country, but as elected officials, we have a duty to help decrease negative sentiments and encourage cooperation among all people in this nation. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle share the belief and remember the words of President Bush in the days after September 11. President Bush said, "America counts millions of Muslims among our citizens, and Muslims make an incredibly valuable contribution to our country. In our anger and emotion, our fellow Americans must treat each other with respect." With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. And I'll just take the liberty, I'll give you time to respond if you wish. But you mentioned the lawsuit that was filed against the NYPD. You also quoted John Brennan earlier on. I think you should say that, also put in the record, that John Brennan just last April 21st said that he has full confidence the NYPD is doing things consistent with the law, and he gave them specific credit for being able to identify and stop terrorist operatives and terrorist attacks here on our shore. The success is in the record in terms of keeping the city safe. So if we're going to put something in the record about the NYPD, I think the counter should be put in from the leading Homeland Security advisor in this administration, where he says he fully supports the NYPD and the actions they've taken. We have a distinguished panel. Okay. Sure.
I actually
gentleman from Mississippi.
Consent that the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, be allowed to sit in on the hearing.
These hearings will not be complete without Mr. Green being present.
Thank you.
Reserving the right to object, but I won't. No. Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is allowed to be seated. We have a distinguished panel of witnesses for our important hearing today. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Zuhdi Jasser back to our committee. It was appropriate for Dr. Jasser to be here today because he was the lead-off witness at our first radicalization hearing last year. He's the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, an organization he formed in the wake of the 9/11 attacks as a effort to provide an American Muslim voice advocating the preservation of the founding principles of the United States Constitution. Dr. Jasser served 11 years in the United States Navy as a medical officer and as a physician currently residing in Phoenix, Arizona. Ms. Asra Nomani is a professor in the practice of journalism at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. She's a former reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the author of, quote, "Standing Alone, an American Woman's Struggle for the Soul of Islam." During a time in Pakistan in 2002, Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl was staying in Ms. Nomani's home when he was kidnapped. She became active in the ensuing investigation to find him. She has provided commentary for CNN, NPR, and BBC, and has served as an instructor at Islamic culture training centers for the federal government. She was born in Bombay, India, and came to the U.S. with her family at the age of 4. Dr. Quanta Ahmed is the author of In the Land of Invisible Women, a female doctor's journey in the Saudi kingdom, and is a prolific writer on political and religious issues relating to Islam. Dr. Ahmed serves as an associate professor of medicine at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and has practiced pulmonary and critical care medicine in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom and in Saudi Arabia. She's the first Muslim woman and first physician to be selected to be a Templeton Cambridge Journalism Fellow in Science and Religion at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Ahmed, this is how I first came to know, has played a strong role in treating 9/11 workers under the recently passed James Agroda law and has treated many law enforcement officers from the FBI and NYPD. Ms. Faiza Patel serves as the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Before joining the Brennan Center, Ms. Patel worked as a senior policy officer at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague and clerked at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Ms. Patel is a graduate of Harvard College and the New York University School of Law. I would thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I would also remind them that your full testimony will be submitted for the record, and I ask you to summarize your statements and try to keep them within 5 minutes. And the Chair now recognizes Dr. Jasser for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman King, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee for seeking my testimony again, allowing me to give you an update about what we've learned from your hearings so far and also where we're headed. From the first hearing last March, the American Muslim community's response to Muslim radicalization, this process has shed the light of day for many Americans upon areas that we need to address, diagnose, and begin the process of solving the ideological threat we face from Islamist radicalization. And make no mistake, as much as we've had some successes at countering some of the violence, at the end of the day, the threat, if anything, is growing with the growth of Islamist radicalism in the Middle East, and we see Islamist parties coming to power in many countries. For many, that very statement in these hallowed halls is heresy. But for me, this is a lifelong mission to confront the problems within my faith community that are a threat to both our country and my co-religionists. While I'm sure that much of today's discussion will focus on a portrayal of American Muslims as supposed victims of some right-wing conspiracy, the reality is that I'm an American Muslim and I'm not a victim. Since your hearings began, so many Muslims told us that they were tired of having their identities stolen by two groups. One is the radicals that commit acts of terrorism, and the other are the grievance groups, whose denials, lawsuits, and cries of bigotry have actually caused more negativity towards Islam and Muslims than bridge building. So our work is about reclaiming my faith from a political construct that is discriminatory and a threat, not because it has the chance of bringing down a republic in my lifetime, but because its primary target is the freedom and liberty of my children. So many Muslims acknowledge to us that we can't address it without peeling the onion of Islamism away from Islam. It is absurd to allow a threat that exploits our religion to avoid any critique in these hallowed halls because of its theological, political underpinnings may offend the majority of a faith. You can't allow a threat to instantly wrap itself in a faith and then all of a sudden be insulated because you may say that it may offend a majority. In fact, the primary way then to engage this threat is exactly what these hearings were about, through engaging responsible, unapologetic Muslims who seek the truth and want to better their faith from the causes of radicalism. Does this mean that I or anyone who engages in these hearings believe that all Muslims are a threat? Absolutely not, and I think it's offensive to imply that I believe that. But I do believe that by not confronting these issues, we are allowing the radicals and extremists to define our faith for the world. And again, I do not submit one iota of my own civil rights when I discuss these issues. What these hearings provide is a dialogue that can bridge the gap for those that see no problem within the Muslim community with those that see all Muslims as a problem. The polarization that we saw leading to these hearings resulted in hysteria that decried bigotry, Islamophobia, and McCarthyism, to name a few. I was even told by Islamist leaders through emails and communications that my testimony would lead to hate crimes against Muslims. 16 months later, we've had hundreds of new members come after my testimony. We've developed a coalition, the American Islamic Leadership Coalition, that quadrupled in size in the months after our testimony. And we've begun to learn from your further hearings about more work that we need to do. Our success, growth, and feedback has demonstrated the opposite. I want to read you a couple statements I received from Muslims around the country right after my testimony. Zulfi from Virginia stated, "I commend you for the excellent presentation, Dr. Jasser. I felt like for the first time a Muslim is speaking for me. You stole what I was thinking all along." Nabil from Ohio said, "Allahu Akbar, Dr. Jasser. Today I am happy to see a Muslim who thinks like me. The first word in Islam is Iqra, or read." Zuhair from Kansas said, "What you've been expressing is exactly why my family came from Saudi Arabia. I want to know how to become a member. I want to help as much as I can change the way Muslim youth feel about this country and about Arab dictators. And the way these hearings have been and seen an exponential growth in our support. But there has been also the other side of the response, those that have attacked us for fear-mongering and have tried to stifle our conversation and tried to stifle the fact that we are a diverse faith community, diversity not only ethnically but ideologically, which I think we often forget in this very ideologically diverse halls. 10 years after 9/11, our heroes at Department of Homeland Security remain occupied with basically a whack-a-mole program, and even any discussion about the fact that it's not just violence but ideology that radicalizes is often suppressed. If we cannot develop a strategy, if you look at the National Strategy for Counterterrorism, for example, that the White House put out only months after our hearings began, they mentioned the word ideology from the White House, but not once did they identify what that ideology was. Our coalition developed criteria by which we recommend, and your chairman distributed that.
Doctor, if you could try to close in about 10 seconds, 15 seconds.
As a husband, a parent of 3 children, and a leader of my own community, I took a keen interest in these hearings. Please join me and other Muslims in asking you to continue these hearings so that they can know that they can keep asking a wide array of leaders questions against conventional wisdom without fear of intimidation and being silenced. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jassa. The Chair now recognizes Ms. Nomani for her opening statement. Thank you so much. Turn your microphone.
I'm an amateur at this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman King and Ranking Member Thompson, for the invitation to come here. Thank you to all the representatives that are here and to all of our guests here in the hearing room. Last year, I awakened my son in the pre-dawn darkness of a March morning. It was the first hearing that you were holding, and he was 8 years old at the time. A 4 a.m. wake-up call was not in his idea of a great day. But I wanted him to come to this hearing because he is a boy who was born in 2002, the first of our generation post 9/11. We're a Muslim family that I come from, and he inherits, in my mind, the interpretation of Islam, this challenge that we have of extremism in our community. It's our children's generation that will continue to carry this responsibility of how to tackle this very serious problem. We waited in line, and I bring him here today. He gets a seat without having to wake up in the dawn. I bring my parents because, to me, they are my moral compass in the conversation I'm going to have with you today. I'm going to try to speak to you from the heart, both as a mother and as a Muslim, as a journalist who's reported on the issue of extremism, and then also as a friend. When my colleague and friend from the Wall Street Journal, Danny Pearl, left my house for the interview from which he did not come back, the men who met him at the compound where he was then killed slayed him in the name of Islam, the way that we slaughter animals inside of our faith. They cleaned the floor that was bloodied, and then they did their prayer. To me, that was the greatest betrayal of the faith that my parents had taught me. And the frustration that so many people have felt from Muslims who don't acknowledge this problem is the same one that I have felt, because it is a real issue. The idea of extremism and terrorism is grounded in religious theology for so many people inside of our faith. As a communicator, what I want to try to break down for you is why I think this is happening, so that perhaps we can try to heal some of the wounds and the grievances and much of the pain that I think is part of this conversation. I believe that in our Western society, we have what you call this low context culture, this idea that we go from point A to point B. So when you ask a Muslim, is there a radicalization problem in the community, you're going to expect a straight answer. But inside of our Muslim community, we're defined very much by this loopy kind of conversational style that's associated with high context cultures that African American society also has, that Hispanic society, that a lot of societies from Asia also have. And what happens is a potential culture clash where you can't talk to each other. In our Muslim community then, a former FBI analyst and agent has identified that we are very much wound collectors. We talk about the Crusades, we talk about the Ottoman Empire, colonialism, and all the grievances. And when you have a cycle of wounds, you create a circle of denial, I believe, where you in fact respond to issues of seriousness with defensiveness, dismissiveness, deflection, denial, demonization also, so that you end up saying, you're picking on us, you're at a war with Islam. And what has happened then, in my eyes, is that we as a community have denied much of the problem. And for me, these hearings are really a critical conversation to be had. I know that they're not easy and they're very difficult, and especially in a culture like mine where shame is such a critical component, it represents a type of shaming. But what I'd like to gently suggest to both my community and to those who are trying to communicate with it is that we can move from collecting wounds to owning up. That in our Muslim faith, we have a theology. We have a verse in the Quran that says very clearly, stand up for justice, even if it's against your own kin. That's a really difficult idea for any community. But I fundamentally believe that inside of an Islam of grace, we can actually have a conversation that brings healing to all the communities involved. And I thank you for this opportunity to be part of that conversation. I thank my son for being here and my parents for being that accountability in my own life so I could come to you and speak to you from the heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nomami. And the Chair now recognizes Dr. Ahmed for her opening statement. Dr. Ahmed.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman King, and to all of the distinguished members of the panel for this opportunity to testify. I practice both Islam and medicine. I have lived and worshipped in the United States for 14 years. My interest in this issue is spiritual, academic, and clinical in several matters. I've practiced medicine in Saudi Arabia, in London, where I treated British Muslim diaspora patients, and currently in New York, I care for a number of World Trade Center first responders without financial burden through the providence of the Zadroga Bill, which has given me a special insight into the burdens of radical Islamist acts on Americans 10 years after the acts are committed. In my capacity as a Templeton Cambridge Journalism Fellow, I chose to study jihadist ideologies at the University of Cambridge, and as a result, earlier this year in March, traveled to the SWAT to actually see a school called Sabaun that many in the State Department will be familiar with, which de-radicalizes child militants who are working with the Pakistani Taliban. So on one hand, I've seen the impacts of violent Islamist extremism, and on the other hand, I've seen how individuals who are vulnerable between the ages of 10 and 20 are inducted into these acts. Looking at the findings of the investigative hearings to which I've been recently privy, it's clear that similar patterns are at work here in the United States, where vulnerable individuals can be isolated and seduced into a nihilistic and quite separatist ideology, which is not a religion. What's so important about these hearings, and why we actually need a synopsis of the hearings, is the distinction between Islam and Islamism has been lost in the public discourse, and I think these hearings actually provide us that. Islam is a monotheistic spiritual faith. Islamism is a political ideology with totalitarian missions and is well described within the fields of political science. The reaction to the hearings in the Muslim community I can speak to you about come from a number of readers. I have over 100,000 copies of my book sold, many in Muslim majority countries and of course here in the United States. And the reactions are predictable. People are afraid of the scrutiny and hence the accusations that this process is somehow Islamophobic, when I regard it as deeply Islamophilic to be able to distinguish an ideology from a spiritual belief, as well as excitement that this discussion is actually entering an auspicious arena where policymakers can understand and learn more about these issues. The incidents in New York, to which I'm privy because a number of my patients are NYPD active duty or disabled officers, are a typical expression of the fears that I think are misplaced based on a myth of understanding the problem rather than the problem itself. If you look at the findings of the hearings, radicalization is occurring in the United States in civilian, military, and prison populations It's not one route exactly. There are multiple different kinds of routes, but they are well familiar to experts who examine this. And this is a real threat. It is by no means a simplistic argument that all Muslims are bad or all Muslims are good. It is much too complex for that to be an assumption. I think there's a great difficulty about discussing this issue because of our shortcomings of language. And by that I mean the syntax and also some of the metaphorical and spiritual loading of the words. We are in a post-9/11 era, in a period of extreme speech in both aspects, whether you are a proponent of violent Islamist ideology, which no one here is, or whether you are an opponent of that, which all of us are. We also have been burdened by a sanitization of the lexicon, which we can use in official conversations, most recently imposed on our law enforcement agencies. If we cannot name these ideologies or talk about these impacts, we certainly can't begin to solve them. Why would a Muslim who has completed the Hajj, as I have, who's been raised by devoted parents, who herself is observant, take this stance? I think really because I'm inspired by one saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, who's identified that if a Muslim can identify a wrong, whoever sees a wrong and is able to put it right with his or her hand must do so. If he cannot, then with his or her tongue. And if he cannot, then with his or her heart. And so with that in mind, I thank you for the opportunity for me to be able to meet the bare minimum of my faith, as the Prophet Muhammad defines it, by identifying a wrong and exposing it as such. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. And now I recognize Ms. Patel. Am I pronouncing your name right? That's right. Ms. Patel for her opening. At least we agree on that. For her opening statement. Recognize for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. Let me begin by thanking Chairman King, Ranking Member Thompson, and the distinguished members of this committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Faiza Patel, and I co-direct the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. I think we all agree that terrorism is a serious threat to our country. Our response must be equally serious and must be driven by evidence, not assumptions and stereotypes. It is with this in mind that I approach today's topic, the response of the American Muslim community to this committee's earlier hearings on radicalization. With due respect to the opinions of those who have testified before me, I have to point out that American Muslims across the country, joined by voices from multiple other faiths, have objected to these hearings as singling out one religious community for undue scrutiny. Why this widespread opposition? The answer, I believe, does not lie in political correctness or defensiveness. We all recognize the importance of congressional oversight. Such oversight should focus on empirical evidence. The premise that radicalization, whether defined as the adoption of a particular belief system or the embrace of actual violence, is prevalent among American Muslims, is contrary to all empirical studies. Polling by the Pew Research Center shows that vast majorities of American Muslims have consistently held the view that suicide bombing and other forms of violence against civilians are never justified. In fact, American Muslims are the most likely among all religious groups to hold this view. Nor has America faced a wave of terrorism from its Muslim residents. A recent study shows that the number of prosecutions for terrorist plots averages approximately 20 per year. As Michael Leiter, the head of the NCTC, testified before this committee last month, this threat is absolutely tiny, a minute percentage. Equally unfounded is the notion of a conveyor belt, a religious conveyor belt, whereby certain Muslims become more religious, then embrace radical views, and finally commit a terrorist attack. But 14 years of research by the RAND Corporation shows that there is no single pathway to terrorism, a conclusion that is shared by security agencies and supported by the weight of social science research. A person's ideology or religiosity is simply not an effective means of predicting terrorism. In contrast, up to 80% of terrorist plots in America have been foiled using good old-fashioned police work directed at signs of actual criminal activity. These types of theories jeopardize our security by driving a wedge between Muslims and law enforcement agencies. American Muslims have provided information on roughly 35% of terrorist plots that have been derailed in the last decade. Top law enforcement officials describe this cooperation as absolutely essential. Singling out one religious community for scrutiny as potential terrorists paints them as a threat. What happens when Americans start to view Muslims as security threats rather than as friends, neighbors, and colleagues? The data from 2011 are not available, but the data from 2010 show increasing anti-Muslim sentiment. 45% of Americans believe that the values of Islam are at odds with the American way of life. According to the FBI, anti-Muslim hate crimes in the United States rose by almost 50% in 2010. EEOC data show dramatic increases in complaints of anti-Muslim bias in the workplace. Muslims constitute less than 1% of this country's population. They now constitute 25% of the complaints received by the EEOC. According to the Justice Department, while Muslims make up less than 1% of the population, some 7% of the cases investigated under the law that bars discrimination against houses of worship have involved mosques. These statistics suggest that, rather than focusing narrowly on American Muslims' reaction to these hearings, we would do well to consider the real experience of Muslims in this country, which includes hate crimes and employment discrimination and opposition when they try to fulfill their fundamental duty to pray. In closing, I'd like to ask this committee to reject these divisive assumptions about American Muslims. Like all religious communities, American Muslims are committed to the security of our country, and America will be safest when we all work together towards this goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jassa, in your prepared statement, page 9, you state, quote, that fear of political correctness has been bolstered by leading Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups in America who trumpet grievances at the expense of counter-radicalization strategies. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman. I think that's a really important issue is that if you're going to address a problem, there's only a certain amount of bandwidth the United States has to addressing each issue we have that we're concerned about. And when you look at the Muslim issue, if you will, or radicalization, what happens is if you label anybody that addresses this as an Islamophobe or a bigot, it stifles free speech. It prevents us from dealing with the very issue that we need to. And yet it's interesting, Ms. Patel was actually quoting statistics on hate crimes, connecting it to our discussion here with no evidence to show there's any connection at all to any of that. If anything, I would tell you that the environment in the United States in which we're unable to discuss this, in which all Americans see are Muslims that are claiming victimization, that don't want to address the issue as actually being in denial, I think that type of movement is actually more responsible for creating a climate of fear, rather than if Americans actually saw us taking ownership, as Ms. Nomani mentioned, actually Americans would realize that we're the most important tool, the most important asset in treating the problem. But what happens is Ms. Patel was refusing to accept the conveyor belt concept. Well, if there isn't a conveyor belt, then I guess terrorists self-combust immediately and become terrorists on the spot overnight. As I mentioned in my first testimony, Nidal Hassan did not get radicalized overnight, and that ultimately we as Muslims need to lead the effort to try to address that. But many of us that do get labeled in many ways as being anti-Muslim. My family was horrified to see me labeled by groups such as the Muslim Public Affairs Council or CARE as being anti-Muslim, and there's been slander thrown around about me, when in fact I've helped build a number of mosques around the country, and I've been very involved in my faith community. But when you take on Islamism, they want to make you pay a price for that because they have a lot of self-interest in preventing America from looking at Islamism.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Nomani, did you see any increase in hate crimes or any anti-Muslim activity after these hearings began?
Well, from my vantage point, what I believe has happened is that Americans are very frustrated with Muslims, and I don't believe that it's about anger. I come from West Virginia, where talk about stereotypes, so we would expect some of the most intolerant ideas, right, about Muslims or others from other countries. And we grew up there, and I felt only like a mountaineer in that state. And I believe that throughout this country, what has happened is that people are really frustrated with this culture of denial. That as long as you say to CNN Major Nidal Hassan was not a Muslim, or the hijackers were not practicing Islam. You're denying a truth inside of our community of an ideology that has very much corrupted people's minds. And I think that leads to frustration. I was on the streets of New York City during the protests to the Ground Zero Mosque, as it's being called. And I don't believe it's as much hate as it is frustration. It's a frustration with a community that's not owning its own problems.
Thank you. If I could ask Ms. Patel, you mentioned, sort of implied that somehow this committee is focusing on the Muslim community and we're off on our own, or this is the wrong approach to take. In the testimony that was being submitted by the Department of Homeland Security today by John Cohen, as I read it, he says, today the Department of Homeland Security operates with the understanding that as it relates to domestic violent extremism, we face the greatest terrorist risk from those extremists who have either been recruited by al-Qaeda or its affiliates or inspired by their ideology. This threat is real, as evidenced by the multiple recent thwarted attacks of domestic violent extremists inspired by al-Qaeda's ideology. Now, ipso facto, they are Muslims. Now, so what the spokesman for Homeland Security is saying is the leading threat to this country today comes from supporters of al-Qaeda. Supporters of al-Qaeda are Muslims. So somehow to suggest that there is not a correlation between terrorist threats and people of the Muslim faith, as small a minority as that may be, I think it's totally erroneous. And also, for instance, you mentioned that Muslims are only 1% of the population, yet when Eric Holder gave his numbers, 90% of the terrorist crimes are carried out by 1% of the population. So to say that that is not a real threat that we should focus on, and then you talk about hate crimes, well, there's 5 times as many anti-Semitic incidents every year as anti-Muslim, and the populations are relatively proportionate. So I would just think that you would be, not that I'm giving you advice, but to acknowledge, yes, there is a problem. We could dispute the extent of the problem. We could dispute exactly how it should be addressed. But somehow to deny that there's any correlation between certain people of the Muslim faith and the greatest terrorist threat facing this country today just it defies credulity. It just does not add up at all, and I think it just weakens your case. And certainly you can answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America faces a number of threats today. Terrorism in the name of Islam is certainly one of them. And I certainly would not say that there is anything wrong with Congress looking at such an important issue. What I say, though, is that Congress should look at this issue on the basis of empirical evidence. And on the basis of the research that has been done, all of that research shows that the idea of a religious conveyor belt that leads a person directly from embracing a religion to becoming a radical, to becoming a terrorist, simply does not serve as a way to predict violence. We can use a model like that to understand past cases of violence, but we cannot statistically use a model like that to focus on how other people are going to conduct violence. And that is something that has been included in all social science studies, including from the Department of Defense.
I don't think anyone is saying that because you're Muslim, you're going to be a terrorist. What we're saying is that the leading terrorist threat today comes from certain people who are Muslims. And that, to me, is the reality we have to face. That's not saying any more than anyone said all Italians from the Mafia or all Irish from the Westies. You don't say that, but that's where they look. The FBI went to the Italian social clubs. They went to the Irish bars on the west side of Manhattan. Now when they're looking for the Russian mob, they go to Brighton Beach and Coney Island. And that's just good police work.
Chairman King, could I add something? Oh, sorry.
Actually, my time has expired, so I'm sorry. The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you very much. Ms. Patel, obviously you have hit some chords with the committee. I've never seen a witness take on another member's testimony and not answer the question that he was asked, but if that's how he chose to use his time, so be it. Let me take on the next paragraph of Mr. Cohen's statement so we can put it into the record. Mr. Cohen said, however, we also know that violent extremism can be inspired by various religious, political, or other ideological beliefs. Many communities and rural counties nationwide face such threats. For example, violent, sovereign citizen extremists have engaged in violence against state and local law enforcement. So there are all kinds of things operating here in this country, not just people of a particular faith. Ms. Patel, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to Dr. Jass's takeoff on what you said.
Microphone? Ms. Patel, your microphone, please.
Sorry. I too am a novice. I think Dr. Jasser was suggesting that there must be a religious conveyor belt that leads a person to become more religious and then subsequently more violent and then to commit an act of terrorism, because terrorism doesn't happen overnight. In fact, if you look at the studies of terrorism, and I refer you to the 2007 study by the NYPD, it actually points out that the decision-making process for becoming a terrorist can actually be quite quick, or it can be quite long. That's precisely the point, that it is not a process in the sense that you can go from point A to point B to point C. Of course, terrorists who are acting in the name of Islam have radical ideology. That is the very understanding of the crime of terrorism. It is based on an ideological premise. So you're always going to find that when you look at populations of convicted or indicted terrorists. But the point is that you cannot look at ideology as a predictor of violence. And that's something that, doesn't necessarily relate to the post-9/11 context. That is a principle that has been established by social science researchers going back to the beginning of this century. So I would stand by my critique of the religious conveyor belt theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ahmed, you referenced that you see a number of individuals from the New York Police Department in your practice. Are you under any contract with the City of New York or the Police Department?
Absolutely none. I'm an employee of Winthrop University Hospital, and I've declared that I have no affiliations.
So there's no connection?
No, but I'm required to be a healthcare provider for World Trade Center first responders,
Sure.
who number 6,000 on Long Island, 2,500 of whom come to my hospital.
Well, I've been in the neighborhood, and I appreciate the work that you've done. You are not an American citizen, is that correct?
That's correct. I'm a permanent resident in the United States.
Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah. So you don't have any kind of security clearance or anything? Your information is based on your research?
My information is based on a 12-year career of teaching and training and mentoring individuals across the Muslim world. Mm-hmm. It is also based on a 43-year history of being a Muslim by birth, by being a person who's completed the Hajj and observes all 5 pillars of Islam, by being part of a very elite program, if you're free to look at it, the Templeton Cambridge Journalism Fellowship Program, and by personally investing my own time and my own resources in traveling to remote areas in Pakistan to meet militant child operatives. You are quite correct to identify that I have no fiscal, no political, and no other affiliations in this other than I have a responsibility to expose what is masquerading as Islam.
Well, and again, we thank you for your service. But
and thank you for the question too, to allow me to clarify my permission.
Well, you've clarified it, but I want to close it by saying you don't have a security clearance. You've not been briefed by intelligence officials in any capacity as an intelligence person. So what you're giving is your own review of what you've done over the years, and that has value, but it also requires, for some of us, the fact that you are here as a private citizen and not anything else, and you don't have to comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just say we invited Dr. Ahmed as a private citizen. So, gentleman from California, Mr. Longman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just kind of bewildered, frankly, by some of the questions and comments of my colleagues here. That somehow your testimony isn't valid because you don't have a security clearance. I don't know. The longer I'm here, I guess the less I'm surprised by what I hear at times. Ms. Patel, in your report, Rethinking Radicalization, you report that the Council on American Islamic Relations condemned the FBI's use of surveillance measures, particularly of mosques, predicated on the idea that Muslims present security concerns minus any suspicion of criminal activity. And I'm informed that the lead plaintiff of the case of California Muslims represented by CARE in the ACLU in the civil case is Imam Yasser Fazaga of the Orange County Islamic Foundation. And allegedly the FBI sent an informant to his mosque to determine if anything improper was taking place there, and CARE found that to be objectionable. Although I'm no longer from that area, I am familiar, since I lived for 40-some years in that area, and the newspaper of record in that area is the Long Beach Press-Telegram. And on October 30th, 2002, it reported that the imam stated the following at a public meeting. He hailed as freedom fighters those Palestinians whom the Western media label as suicide bombers. He asserted that few casualties of the suicide bombers are innocent victims. Quote, "No one is an innocent civilian. These victims are collateral damage. And as a result of the freedom fighters, waves of Jews are leaving Israel. That's a great success for the Palestinians." He said Palestinians dance in the streets after the September 11th attacks because they know that U.S.-made helicopters, U.S. munitions are killing their relatives and neighbors. Given those remarks in a public setting, do you think it was improper for the FBI to utilize an informant to at least report on what the imam was saying in his mosque? Is that inappropriate behavior by law enforcement as suggested by CARE and as referenced in your report?
I think when law enforcement has information that leads it to believe that people are advocating violence, and they have every right to go into a mosque.
Well, if you would take as correct those comments, I don't know if they are correct, but as reported in the Press-Telegram, do you believe that that would be a sufficient basis for the FBI to permit an informant to go to the mosque to observe what the imam is saying?
I actually don't know whether that would be allowed under the current FBI rules.
I didn't ask on the FBI rules. I'm saying you have criticized in your report law enforcement. At least you've identified CARE's criticism of law enforcement. So that's a specific instance involving a specific plaintiff in a case, and those are the facts that are presented. So I'm asking for your opinion, since you have offered your opinion here as to what you consider as appropriate conduct.
As I said, sir, I think that if law enforcement has information that it believes that there is either criminal activity or the likelihood of criminal activity, or that somebody is advocating violence, that they certainly have every right to go inside a religious institution. The fact that it's a mosque doesn't insulate it from law enforcement scrutiny.
All right. Mr. Namani, you indicated in your written testimony of evidence of radicalization of the Quran by some. You give an indication of a copy of the Quran published by the government of Saudi Arabia, speaking of the first chapter of the Quran, innocuously stating that, "Show us the straight way, the way of those on whom thou hast bestowed thy grace, those whose portion is not wrath, and those who go not astray." That's the original chapter, but yet the copy published by the government of Saudi Arabia says, or published by the King Fahd Complex for the printing of the Holy Quran in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, says, "Guide us on the straight way, the way of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not the way of those who earned your anger, such as Jews, nor those who went astray, such as Christians." Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, where a radical view or reinterpretation of the Quran tends to focus in that case, hatred towards certain other groups, Jews and Christians. Is that the point of your written testimony?
Yes, sir, that exactly is. I brought that Quran with me because I wanted it to serve as a symbolic reminder to me of the ideology of Islam, this interpretation of Islam that is wreaking havoc on our world. To not identify the extremism associated with it, with the religion, to me is naive, and it creates a deeper problem inside of our community because then we don't tackle the problem as it is. This Quran was imported from Saudi Arabia to my hometown mosque in West Virginia. I plucked it from the bookcase, and I plucked it not far from the book called Women in the Shade of Islam that says that we can reinterpret another verse to sanction domestic violence against women. And so what I believe does happen is people take the theology, just like they have in every faith, and they go down that slippery slope toward violence. And we have to include a conversation about Islam then when we talk about the extremism that comes from it, because it is the ideology that fuels that violence.
Time of the gentleman's expired. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I guess I will, in an attempt to help my bewildered, puzzled colleague, sometimes people hear what they want to hear as opposed to what was said. And I think that Dr. Ahmad, and the question with Mr. Thompson, what I heard was that he was showing that her testimony was based on her vast experience and the remarkable work that she's done around the world over the years. And sometimes it helps so that people understand whether testimony is coming from the intelligence community or whether it's coming from life experiences. And I don't think that the fact that it comes from life experiences diminishes her testimony, nor do I think that the ranking member was trying to diminish her testimony as opposed to just clarifying where it came from. So I hope that helps with the bewilderment. But the other thing I would point out, and Mr. Chairman, when you talk about people's reaction and an objection to the hearings, or the hearing on the hearings, you said in your opening that 90% of the attacks came from Muslims or radicalized people. But the problem we see is that we're only talking about the 90%. It's the 10% that we're not focusing on that keeps me up at night also. So the question becomes, as we talk about Muslim and we talked about Somalia for a minute, the question becomes, do we talk about radicalization in global, in terms of all radicalization in the United States, everyone who poses a threat? And the other thing I would just add, and Dr. Chass, I would seek your opinion on it, and maybe Ms. Patel, is that the initial concept of the hearing, I thought, was disingenuous or overlooked the fact that the Muslim community are very active participants in our fight against terror. And if the numbers are right that I have, if 52 out of the 140 tips come from the Muslim community, then that's over 37% in a time where, especially in minority communities, you have this code of silence. So I don't think that we've properly identified and recognized that the Muslim community is absolutely a partner in our fight against terror. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And as I mentioned, I could not agree with you more, and that's why I cited so many Muslims that reached out to us after your hearings as saying thank you for providing alternative voices. And as I said, you can't solve theological problems within a religion unless you're from that faith. So the issue, though, however, is that the dialogue, that making any linkage between religious interpretations and that radicalism targets the whole population, stifles any reform. And what I would tell you is absolutely the reporting of violence, and as I said in my first testimony, every Muslim I know would report a terrorist act of violence if they saw it about to happen. But that's the final step. That's a whack-a-mole program. If you want to treat the problem, you have to show that we've actually motivated and stimulated Muslims to begin reform programs to counter the ideas that radicalize, the supremacism that other witnesses have also talked about. That has yet to really happen, and anybody that says it's happening, I think, is either in denial or naive to say that we've begun to address, to reinterpret, to provide books on the shelves in mosques and elsewhere that counter these ideas. The bookshelves are far too empty, and there's not enough stimulus in this country to counter these ideas, and that's what I think your hearings bring to the discussion.
Ms. Patel.
Thank you. I think in terms of the extent of violence by American Muslims versus other groups, as Ranking Member Thompson pointed out, there is a lot of evidence that there are other groups that are out there who are also interested in committing violence against our country. The statistics that I've seen put the extent of terrorism by American Muslims domestically focused at between 40 and 57%. There's always a difference in studies as to how they count terrorism cases, so you always come up with different numbers, and I think the Department of Justice's statistics, for example, are very inclusive and include things like like immigration violations. So I just want to put that out there. Turning to this idea of cooperation, I think there's no question but that American Muslims will report any suspicion of terrorist activity. When you ask them to support something more nebulous, like extremism within their community, that's when you run into problems. Because how do you actually define that? Does the fact that a woman is asked to cover her her head when she covers a mosque, extremism? To some people, it may appear the case. To others, it may not. But that is the kind of information that you cannot expect a community to be reporting on. It's just too nebulous. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was just going to close with the fact that I think that I would ask that we just not have blinders on and focus on just the Muslim community when you in your testimony said that you thought it was responsible for 90%. There's 10% still out there. I think we owe it to the American people to focus on them also.
And I would say, in response to that, if you yield, is that this committee was set up primarily in response to 9/11. We do have other committees, and obviously we have subcommittees who do look at these other issues. Having said that, when the Department of Homeland Security says the main threat is from groups linked with al-Qaeda, and when there does not appear to be a consensus that, as we see from your witness today, that we should be looking at the Muslim community, then I think these hearings are essential. If we had unanimity, yes, there's a real problem in the community and we should address it, then we would not have the need for these hearings. The reason we had to have the hearings is to meet the denial of a reality, and that's why I thought it was important to have these hearings, and not to minimize in any way the others, whether they're narco-terrorists in this country or American Nazis or Ku Klux Klan or whatever. The fact is, this committee, I look upon it, since it was set up in the aftermath of 9/11, as was the Department of Homeland Security, to combat Islamic extremism first, and then also to, obviously, other issues are pertinent, but I think the Judiciary Committee is well suited for the other, but not to say we're going to look the other way on it at all. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Al-Qaeda's stated goal is to bring down the infidel in Western civilization. I was the chief of counterterrorism in the Justice Department. It's clear the hijackers came from a certain background. We can't deny the fact that they were Muslim. Major Hassan, just north of my district in Fort Hood, was radicalized by al-Awlaki out of Yemen, and right next to my district. Killed 13 soldiers. I went to the funeral. I saw the boots, the combat boots, and the rifles. This is real. It's real stuff. And Ms. Patel, for you to say that these hearings do not rest on firm factual basis, I would say you talk to those families. And when you say we adopt a view of radicalization that treats religious belief as a precursor to terrorism, I would argue that we have to look at the obvious, that there is a religious component to this. It doesn't reflect the vast majority of Muslims, I agree. The vast majority are good, law-abiding citizens. But there are those within the United States, the enemy within, that do want to do us harm and bring down this nation and kill our soldiers and kill innocent civilians, like Daniel Pearl, who was slayed, as you very dramatically, Ms. Namani, testified to. 90%, as the chairman said, of these acts are committed by 1% of the population. So I understand your statistics, but when you look at the overall picture, I strongly disagree with your testimony, and I find it somewhat offensive to the victims. I don't know if you have any comments to that.
I think the one comment I would make is that, I live in this country. I live and work in New York City, right by Ground Zero. I have 2 kids. They go to school every day. They take the subway. I'm a mother. I think about their safety. I, too, worry about terrorism. I, too, am not unsympathetic to people whose families die because of violence and terrorism. Of course not. But I think that the best way to keep our country safe is to use evidence to drive counterterrorism policy. And when I look at the studies and what they show me that using religiosity or using ideology as a predictor for who is going to become a terrorist and who is not simply doesn't work.
Can I just stop on that? Because I think ideology is important. I think the moderate Muslim is the most effective weapon we have against radical Islam. I think we can defeat him on the battlefield, and we have, but we can't kill it. I mean, it's an ideology. It's a struggle for ideology. And that, at the end of the day, are we going to win or lose this? Some would say the war on terror is over, and that presumes that radical Islam is over. I would argue radical Islam is, unfortunately, alive and well, and it's an ideological struggle that if we don't win this, it will bring down Western civilization. And I'd like to get the other panelists' viewpoint on how do we win this war on ideology, and are we in fact winning it?
Well, sir, I believe that the Society of the United Kingdom, the government of the United Kingdom, has directly now confronted this real phenomena that you're talking about, that we also have nonviolent extremism. It is the rhetoric that Dr. Jasser is talking about that is in our mosques. It is the theology that is being exported from the government of Saudi Arabia into our country. And this is a very difficult conversation to be had, I know, because the government of Saudi Arabia is an ally. But I will tell you that as a woman inside of my faith, one of the hardest parts about practicing my faith is the interpretation of Islam that comes out of Saudi Arabia and tells me in my mosques here in America that I have to sit behind a wall, that I have to sit in the basement. Maybe sometimes I don't even get a room. And so from mosques from Seattle to Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., and the Upper East Side of New York City, I've been thrown out of those mosques because I've dared to believe something that the civil rights movement taught me, which is separate is not equal. And yet it is the theology that comes out of Saudi Arabia that makes that a practice in the U.S., and I would argue becomes a dangerous precursor for violence, extremism. It's not definitely a certain indicator, but once you go down that slippery slope of interpretation, it becomes dangerous.
See, my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman expired. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Richardson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to ask that the following reports from the Triangle Center and the Center for American Progress be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. And then I'd like to defer about 20, 30 seconds to Mr. Richmond for a follow-up, and then I'll reclaim my time.
Mr. Chairman, just referring back to the John Coyne letter that many of us cited earlier, I'll just read this simple paragraph. We also know that violent extremism can be inspired by various religious, political, or other ideological beliefs. Many communities in rural counties nationwide face such threats. For example, violent sovereign citizens extremists have engaged in violence against state and local law enforcement. Recognizing this, DHS has designed a countering violent extremism approach that applies to all forms of violent extremism, regardless of ideology. I would just suggest that we should also follow that same approach.
Gentleman from California.
Reclaiming my time. I'd like to now just clarify some comments that were made earlier. You know, as a member on this Homeland Security Committee, you know, I think it's appropriate to ask a person's qualifications because, after all, we as members of Congress and our staff must have security clearances. to participate in discussions and to hear information. So the fact that we would want to know, is there any validity or, real facts or reasons behind some of the things that's being provided to us, I don't think is an unreasonable question and a request. I'd like to further say that, this committee, we're not a talk show. This isn't Oprah. This isn't entertainment. This isn't radio. This is the United States Congress. And so I would just ask, and Mr. King, I'm trying to speak in all due respect to you. I would just ask that in the future, if we're going to have a U.S. congressional hearing, which in my mind is a big thing, I believe that at least some of the panelists should be people who have the authority, who receive the regular information, to give us the most accurate, helpful information as possible that we can blend in with other community thoughts. But I think otherwise, to me, this is similar to like a community town hall or something like that, that I don't think rises to the level of the United States Congress.
Well, I cannot disagree with you. It's a question, I guess, of who or what rises to the level of the U.S. Congress. But the fact is
Mr.
that...
Chairman, I didn't...
Oh, you were asking me a question. I thought you were going to give me the courtesy to answer. You weren't asking a question.
No, I...
Oh, okay, fine. Good.
But go ahead. Go ahead. I just want to make sure I don't lose my time.
No, it's your time then. I'll say it later.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect, again, I'm not looking to pick a fight here, but what I am saying is, for me as a member on this committee, I don't mind people's personal thoughts and their opinions, but what I think it should also be coupled with is professionals who do this work, who have this information, and we...
Well, if the gentlelady, you would yield on that then. And I will give you the time at the end. Whatever I take, you'll yield
Sure.
back
Go
to
ahead,
you. Yeah. First of all, the purpose of this hearing was to hear from the community. If the gentlelady is interested in getting classified information or security-based information, we have briefings all the time. We have briefings in the SCIF that are made available to all members. The fact of this hearing, the purpose of this hearing, is to connect with real people, people who are citizens. I don't think we have such an elitist attitude that we're only going to hear from people who have security clearances. The fact is that we're talking about people who are in the trenches, people who live real lives, who are out there, who are not coming here as bureaucrats, not coming here as government elite, but they're coming here as real people. And to me, that's what the Congress of the United States is about, to hear from people, to represent the people. We only represent the people by hearing from them, not by listening to bureaucrats. They give us information. We get great information from the CIA, the FBI, NCTC, Homeland Security. They give us very excellent briefings. Many of the members, I haven't seen you at many of them, but I know we do have them, and we get them, and they give the most detailed, classified, top-secret information. And I would suggest you go to a few of those and then blend it into what you hear from real people. And the clock was stopped, so you have 1 minute and 49 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, I'm offended by your reference to me at classified briefings. I'll provide to you my record. And I think it's very inappropriate for you to say this in a public forum.
I would say it's more inappropriate for you to somehow compare this to Oprah Winfrey, when we have real people who have given of their time to come in to testify before us, perhaps at risk themselves, coming in here, giving of their time, and being willing to share their experiences with us.
Are you going to put my time back in?
You get 11 seconds, right? Actually, the clock stopped.
It stopped after you talked.
And you get, okay, you'll get 1 minute and 38 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, if you go back to my comments, my objection is not, and I'm thankful for the testimony that we have before us. My suggestion or my request as a member of your committee was that you would consider in the future, if we have hearings such as this, that you would also have a witness that could provide accurate testimony to also what's being heard in the community, to make sure that we, decision makers, can make the best possible decisions. That was my simple request. Let me go on to Mr. Jasser and actually the other members who are here. Of the folks who are here who are testifying, other than being a Muslim, is there any specialized knowledge or expertise on terrorism and law enforcement that you have before this committee?
10 years of a nonprofit foundation that's been working in this area and published in multiple journals and magazines and academic journals in the country for 10 years, ma'am. Not to mention, by the way, I do have a security clearance, top secret, which has been of no value in this work, but I do have one. But to identify that somehow, actually, I think you're feeding into tribalism concepts that somehow the tribal leaders of our
Jasser?
community need to
Mr.
be the ones to
Jasser,
speak. Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me. I asked a simple question. Do you have specialized knowledge or expertise in terrorism and law enforcement? Yes or no?
Terrorism and law enforcement? No, ma'am.
Thank you. The next witness.
Yeah, for the last 10 years, ever since my friend Danny's murder, I've been, as a journalist,
No, ma'am.
investigating.
My question is,
I've been investigating.
do you have
I'm
specialized
answering your question.
knowledge or expertise in terrorism and law enforcement? Yes or no?
Yes, so I have had specialized knowledge related to domestic terrorism and international terrorism, and for the last 4 years, I've been a trainer to the U.S. military on issues of terrorism and violence inside of our Muslim community.
Ma'am.
Thank you for your question. I've lived the Islamist narrative in Saudi Arabia. I've also in Pakistan, and I did detailed research for my book, which is now 6 years post-publication. I would consider that credentials. I'm not credentialed by the U.S. government.
Thank you. And ma'am, the last one.
Thank you. My credentials are simply that I have researched in this field for the last 4 years.
Thank you.
And let me just add that I think Ms. Patel is an ideal witness. I'm not questioning your qualification. You're extremely qualified to be here today, and I mean that sincerely, based on your experience. Whether we agree or disagree, you certainly are extremely qualified. Gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Kravak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Patel, you are the minority witness, are you not?
That sounds sort of spooky, but yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we do have a minority witness. This is not a stacked deck, and that you can speak from the other. Okay, Ms. Patel, I appreciate your opportunity of being here today. In your prepared statement on page 1, you discuss the hearings and assert that they, meaning the committee's hearings, quote, adopt a view of radicalization that treats religious beliefs as a precursor to terrorism. I must reemphasize, in some of the conversation we've had here today, it's particularly troubling to me actually, that these hearings have persistently asserted that it is a violent Islamic extremist ideology promoted by al-Qaeda and not, let me reemphasize that, not the religion of Islam that is driving the radicalization to homegrown terrorist activity. To confuse this fact and blur the lines between the Islamic extremist ideology and the religion of Islam is playing into the terrorist propaganda promulgated by al-Qaeda to justify the narrative. I therefore ask you, Ms. Patel, are you familiar with the ideology of Islamic extremism? And if so, are you capable of differentiating between the Islamic extremism ideology being promoted by al-Qaeda and the religion of Islam?
Thank you for that question, sir. I think what I'm trying to say, and maybe it's not exactly eloquent, is that when you look at theories of radicalization, which have been discussed in these committees' hearings several times, and you look at how they paint the trajectory of how somebody goes from being religious to becoming radical to embracing violence to committing violence, the signs of radicalization that are identified by these theories are by and large Muslim religious behavior. So they would point to things such as growing a beard, which some men think is required in Islam, to giving up smoking and drinking, again, something that's contrary to Islamic precepts, to giving up hip-hop clothing, that's another one that's been identified, to going to the mosque more frequently. So these are the kinds of things that suggest to me that when you start looking at radicalization, and even if what you're really looking at is political radicalization, you're going to land up looking at religiosity, and that's what we have seen has been happening. Thank you.
I appreciate those comments, ma'am, but besides for the mosque, you could also say the Amish should do the same thing. So, you know, I was talking to Dr. Hamad and discussing her very diverse and unique background, and my background as well, being in the military and being an airline pilot, being able to travel all over the world. 95% of this world just wants a safe place to put their head down at night and to raise their children and hopefully make them better than themselves. That's the 95%. It's the radical portion. No matter what, we're not even talking whether it be radical Islam, radical anything. That's the portion that we're talking about. So let's be distinctively clear on what we're talking about here. Radicalization of Islam, not Islam itself. Do you understand that by alleging that our investigation into the threat from radicalization to terrorist activity is an attack on Islam itself, and that you are fostering al-Qaeda's terrorist narrative? Do you understand that?
Sir, as I explained, when looking at radicalization, all of the theories that have been put forward look at signs of religiosity. And when you start looking at religiosity as a precursor for terrorism, I think you're going down the wrong path.
Well, again, ma'am, you know, when we talk about religiosity, as you say, the same things that you just said about growing a beard, and in other words, going to a mosque and creating a certain lifestyle, could be saying the same as the Amish. We're the most peaceful people around, and nobody's really looking at them of being possible terrorists. So, again, in your prepared statement on page 2, you state, quote, "The second equally faulty assumption of these hearings is that someone who is particularly devout in his or her Islamic faith, as you have said, is well on the way to becoming a terrorist. These hearings have never asserted that a devout Muslims are not on their way of becoming a terrorist. Never has anyone ever said that in this body. Quite the contrary. In fact, they have emphasized that many of the individuals radicalized were recent converts who were susceptible to terrorist narrative. We've heard from many, like Melvin Bledsoe about his son, a convert to Islam who was radicalized, or Mr. Bihi, whose young and impressionable nephew was.
Time the gentleman's expired.
I yield back, sir.
Thank you. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Hahn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. It's very interesting to sit in these hearings and listen to all the testimony. You know, I think, you know, for most of us, we all want to figure out how we get to the core of the threats that are against our homeland. Whoever it is, wherever they come from, what their background is, what their religion is, certainly radical ideology in all forms of religion is troubling to me, is very troubling to me. There are radical Christians that I find troubling in how they've used the Bible to promote a particular behavior, which I disagree with. I was raised in a church that actually didn't allow women to speak. They took one verse in the Bible, "Women shall remain silent," and they used that as a way to keep women from rising to any sort of position in the church. That didn't go over real big with me. So there are people that will take any form of their religion and take it to an extremism, a behavior of violence that all of us, I think, want to root out and come against and find ways to prevent. You know, I think what I've gotten from all of the testimonies is really, it comes down to relationships. It comes down to our friends, our neighbors, those we work with. It's trying to understand when it begins to turn, when this religion or this theology begins to go in the wrong direction, and how do we stop it? How do we find it? How do we prevent it? How do we provide alternate teachings for all of the faiths that I think we come with? I was interested in reading Sheriff Baca's testimony, who was here before, and talked about the success that we're finding. I'm from Los Angeles, so he's my county sheriff. I'm interested in his efforts to create these relationships, these dialogues in Los Angeles County with the Muslim community, and how important it is, as he testified, in fighting future threats, and talking about the Muslim community who has been shoulder to shoulder with him in preventing threats and finding them out, in offering solutions to law enforcement on how we might prevent them. So, Ms. Patel, and others, you're welcome to answer this. What do you think is the best way to foster these relationships? And in your assessment, what is the greatest threat in this country and abroad in the divisiveness and the isolation of the relationships with the Muslim community?
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought up Sheriff Baca, because I do think that he is a model of the way that a law enforcement official can deal with the Muslim community. He has built really strong, non-securitized relationships with the Muslim community, and I think that's a really important point. The LA County Sheriff's Office Muslim Outreach Unit isn't about collecting intelligence. You know, it isn't about counterterrorism. It's simply about reaching out to that community in the same way that they reach out to other communities. It's part of a community policing program that allows the police to understand communities, to understand their concerns, and to work with them to build strategies. I think that that model has been very helpful. You know, we have seen, for example, that not just in Los Angeles County, but also from the LAPD, that they have been very responsive to concerns that communities have brought before them, for example, with respect to the suspicious activity reporting system, which the LAPD just agreed to reform about 3 weeks ago. So you see that there are sincere efforts to build relationships, and the community responds. I think that one thing that would serve as a disincentive to community cooperation is if they perceive that cooperation to be about their faith rather than criminal activity. And that's why when we talk about radicalization and having people report on radicalization, it makes me nervous. Thank you.
If I may add, I think it's interesting. On the one hand, we're either supposed to be law enforcement or terror experts, or if we represent the community, we have to fit into a pigeonhole that somehow we're apologists for the entire representation of the faith. And yet, what I think many of us are here for is that we do have roots in the community, that we do love our faith, but we realize that the greatest threat, as you asked, is actually a theopolitical ideology that we need to counter, because that Islamist threat is hijacking my faith. And I worry about the impact of that threat upon my children in all of the different avenues. And law enforcement and terror experts cannot fix that. You could bring them here for the next 100 years and they will not counter that. While we Muslims can counter that conveyor belt towards radicalization, and we have the opportunity once we have a consensus against
Time evidently has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Belarakis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you for caring about your faith and your community and your fellow American citizens. I really appreciate your testimony today. Dr. Jasser and Ms. Namani and Ms. Ahmad, each of you spoke of your concerns regarding the growth and extremism of Islam within the United States. I share your concerns about this trend. I wanted to ask you, how do you think we should balance this with an individual's right to worship as they choose? And what, in your opinion, is the critical distinction between more conservative Islamic religious practices and those activities that subsequently lead to radicalization and violent extremism activities? Now, I know that Ms. Patel may have covered this. I had to step out for a second. But if you can respond to that, and how can we find the balance that protects an individual's right to worship as they choose, but ensure that our communities are safe and secure? And how can we support the moderate Muslim community so they can, it's as an alternative path to radicalization? These hearings have been terrific, very productive. But what can we do? It's been very informative, but what can we do in addition to these hearings?
Well, I believe that Ms. Patel has a valid point that religiosity doesn't necessarily equal extremism. That, in fact, the Amish indicators, are very much parallel to the ones of a religiosity in a Muslim man. But what I think why we have to have this conversation and why we need to continue to educate ourselves about what terrorism and extremist ideology looks like is so that we can make those distinctions. I believe that, we need to include religion in our threat assessment because we need to identify very clearly how those indicators related to interpretation express themselves. So that doesn't mean because a guy wears his pants up high that he is a terrorist. He may be practicing a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad that he thinks makes him much more religious, or because he grows his beard a certain length, it doesn't make him an extremist. But what we can do is figure out what it is in terms of his ideas about the Jews, the Christians, the West, and other elements, become indicators for terrorism. And that's why I believe that our administration's policy of excluding Islam from that conversation is, quite frankly, naive and very short-sighted.
Dr. Jasser.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Villarakas. I think ultimately what's important and what you can do is to begin to foster platforms, engagement on this issue. And just as in the Cold War, we finally came as a nation to a consensus that communism was a threat. And we didn't have to fire any bullets against the Soviets directly to finally move towards building think tanks and filtering our military and others for those ideological infiltrators. Similarly, Islamism, I watched the hearings on military assessment that you all did. I think if you look at Nasser Abdul, for example, the fact that the Assistant Secretary of the Army gave him conscientious objection status, I find to be offensive as a Muslim. So many Muslims serve proudly, but yet we allowed this individual that turned out to be a terrorist to use his religion to hide behind an excuse to serve this country. And I think ultimately what happened was because of political correctness, our own army could not identify the threat. The Fort Hood report itself does not identify any of the ideologies it should have. And until we can't come to a consensus that Islamism is a threat, and that's why you need Muslims that are doing this reform work to lead the movement to separate Islam from Islamism.
I couldn't agree more. Anyone else on the panel want to address this? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think perhaps one of the most important roles that you can help us is to have a conversation where we take away the shield of Islam from those who subscribe to Islamist ideologies, whether non-violent or violent. And in fact, the two are deeply connected. The non-violent mechanisms do involve subscription to beliefs that are counter to democracy, that involve supremacism, and are often deeply rooted in anti-Semitism. These have no place in Islam. There's no way to describe them without talking about the values of Islam or searching for enclaves within collections of Muslim people, whether they're in Pakistan or whether they're in the United States or anywhere else in the world. As to your point about how to protect a Muslim's right to worship, let me tell you, as a Muslim, I am more free to worship here than any other Muslim majority nation that I've ever been to. Our rights are not at risk. This is not a civil rights issue, which many people are beginning to make. And we must remind individuals who are American or not as to how those freedoms are protected. That's being lost in the debate. Just because we're scrutinizing an area for a problem doesn't mean anybody's civil liberties have been intruded upon.
Thank you very much. Ms. Patel, I don't know if you wanted, I know you.
Time the gentleman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Patel's the opportunity to answer, sure.
Yeah.
Just real quick.
Microphone.
Still learning. Just real quick, I think that the comments from my co-witnesses, I guess, sort of illustrate the problem, which is that what we are talking about here, what they are talking about is, how do you distinguish different Islamic ideologies? How do you strip Islam from political Islam? Those are important conversations, and I certainly wouldn't want to quell them, but I'm not sure that government has a role in those conversations, that government has a role in talking about which version of Islam is good and which version of Islam is bad. Government's role comes when we come to violence. When a particular ideology, regardless of what it is going to impinge on society, is going to affect public safety, that's where government has its most legitimate role, and that's where I would encourage you all to focus. Thank you.
Actually, the time has expired. Mr. Ranking Member, have a unanimous consent request, so we don't forget to do on the testimony of Mr. Cohen.
Yes, for Mr. Cohen's testimony that's been referred to by a number of members, we'd like to include it in the record of this hearing.
Without objection, so ordered. Also, I would like to submit for the record a report compiled by the majority staff on the committee's findings. Ask unanimous consent that it be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Clark, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some questions here, primarily for Ms. Patel, to look at the impact that these hearings may have had on the cooperation of Muslim Americans with law enforcement and on how these hearings may have set a tone that could further divide Muslim Americans from mainstream America. I'm going to ask those, but I hope this is the last set of hearings on this issue. You know, Dr. Ahmed, you said something that about the religious freedoms that are available in this country to practice your faith as you choose it. I completely agree with you, completely. I thank God I was born in this country, that my father, a devout Muslim who immigrated to this country, that helped build one of the first mosques in Michigan, located in a country that provided me with the freedom to follow my faith. Being a little boy in the mosque, and as certain as I was sitting there in the mosque, knowing in my heart that Christ is the Son of God, I could choose to be a Roman Catholic that I am today, lay minister in my church. But I firmly believe that the tone of these hearings, singling out the Muslim American community in our attempt to combat terrorism, I believe it undermines those religious freedoms that we all cherish in this country. And I do believe it's a civil rights issue, and here's why. This is my statement, and I'll allow you to, Ms. Patel, to respond. But in metropolitan Detroit, there was a religious center that was being constructed, and on it, spray painted, was a gun, was a Christian cross, was the word Mohmed, which is a grossly misspelled reference to Muhammad. And then there were the words FU. The building that was under construction was not a mosque. It's a Sikh temple. Sikh, the same people that were murdered after 9/11. These hearings are not an assault against Islam. It's assault against all Americans, especially Asian Americans. I understand that. Being South Asian and black, I've constantly profiled here. There's not a week I walk through this Capitol complex without being stopped and asked for my ID. Why? Why? Come on, people. You know, you want to cite the Quran as being the basis for some of these violent extremists? We can cite any holy book and take words out of context. It's not the words in the book that's the problem. It's the twisted human minds and the evil motives behind people that create this violence. Come on, let's stop attacking religion here. Look, I know some of our intentions may be good, but overall, if we could stay focused on protecting Americans right now from physical harm, that's why I wanted to be on this committee. I need some resources to protect our drinking water system in Detroit from bioterrorist attack. That's what I want to talk about right now. Or how we can have a real cybersecurity bill that'll protect my Ambassador Bridge from being dismantled, the busiest international border crossing in all of North America. I unfortunately realize I've used up most of my time. Ms. Patel, if you could just respond to the fact on your view on these hearings and the impact it may have had in possibly undermining that trust and cooperation between Muslim Americans and law enforcement, that we totally need to help stop any of these potential terrorist attacks. I welcome your comments.
I'm not a law enforcement official, so I would go back to actually the testimony of Sheriff Baca at the first of these hearings, where he points out that, you know, an approach that is based on divisiveness and then singling out a particular religion is not helpful to law enforcement. And we know Muslim Americans have been incredibly helpful to law enforcement. So I think we should make sure that we preserve that relationship in every way we can. Thank you.
May I add one comment?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I think it's a very important example that you've cited. As a nation, whether we are citizens, whether we are experts, whether we are of faith or not, we lack faith literacy. These hearings are not an opportunity to promote Islamophobia in any way, shape, or form, or I would not be abandoning 18 American citizens, many of whom have served this country, to be here with you today. I do think that there is a tremendous lack of awareness amongst the Muslim community of what Islam actually is, and it is undeniable that whatever route of radicalization anyone pursues, Islam is used in the narrative. The narrative begins, there was once a golden age of Islam, there was a fall from the golden age, and in order to restore Muslims to glory, there must be a process towards violent radicalization. That is what Islamists use in their ideology. That is, understanding that and dismantling that comes with help from all levels of society, including Muslims, and it is not something that can be solved without examining Muslims in America or elsewhere in the wider country. In fact, Muslim diaspora communities are particularly of concern, as I know from my native Britain, or as we are seeing in France, I think even currently, or as I have lived in Saudi Arabia. There is a whole spectrum of extremism. On the September 11th, I was in Riyadh treating patients, and my fellow Muslim...
Dr. Ogden, the time of the gentleman has expired. We have to...
The road to enlightenment, though, is not by holding more of these hearings. I yield back my time.
Sure. Mr. Duncan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you. Hanson, thanks for those words. Communism, socialism, fascism, and Islamism.
We'll have order in the hearing room.
Political ideologies.
Again, I would ask the gentleman from New York. The gentleman is speaking. He's entitled to courtesy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Political ideologies. I think it's very clear from Mr. Kovac's line of questioning and others today that this hearing isn't about Islam, but rather it's about Islamists using the institutions of Islam to propagate Islamism. And Ms. Patel talked about the radicalization of Muslims, but she talked about it in light of their fervent belief in Islam. Much in the same way as an evangelical Christian and my belief in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior could be considered radical. But we're not talking about religion here today. We're talking about Islamism being propagated. With all due respect to the Muslims here in the crowd today, the mosque, the cultural centers, and the small groups are being used to radicalize folks that believe in Islam in the belief of Islamism, a political ideology that is beyond, I believe, the religious teachings of Islam. You know, there's no doubt there's 51 publicly known thwarted Islamist-inspired terrorist plots since 9/11 in this country. 51 Islamist-inspired terrorist acts that have been thwarted. That's what this hearing is about today. And to sit here and listen to folks on the other side of the aisle try to berate us for addressing these issues and trying to make it sound like we're attacking Islam, you know, it bothers me. Ms. Namani, in your testimony, you have some verses from the Quran at the beginning. O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even if it may be against yourselves or your parents or your kin. And so I read those words, and I think about the question I had for you today. Taking those words, how can the U.S. government better empower local Muslim communities to fight the radical imams and ideology that threaten your way of life and target your young people for jihad? What can we do to better assist your efforts? And before you answer, thank you for having the courage, all of you, to be here today, because I know there could be persecution within your Muslim community for speaking out. So thank you for your answer.
Thank you so much, and thank you for citing the verse that, to me, is the reason why I sit here before you, because, in fact, we do face the same challenges that anybody does in a community when you dare to challenge the status quo. And I think that one of the ways that we could actually try to help the community is by being compassionate, right, and being empathetic to the grievances that are legitimate in many ways, many of the wounds that exist within the community. Uncles in the community are the children of colonialism. They have felt these great foreign policy decisions that mean nothing to us in the current day. But I don't believe that that compassion and that empathy should make us pull our punches when it comes to accountability. And that's where I feel we're doing this dance. You know, we're doing a dance around this very serious issue, trying to tap dance basically on what the problem is. I'm so glad you were able to go to the mosque as a little boy, because I wasn't, because the ideology that was imported said that I as a girl could not enter the mosque. And so if we are actually honest about it as policymakers, as individuals in the community, and yet kind to the Muslim community, I hope that we can encourage our Muslim community to get out of this culture of shame, where they think that any specific discussion about interpretation is then a condemnation of the entire faith. We're a collectivist community, so we think that if you slam or criticize one part of the teachings or one person like Major Nidal Hassan, it's a condemnation of everyone. And that's where we as a community need to grow up, quite frankly. We as a community need to evolve, and we need to basically be able to think with a rational mind and realize that this criticism is about one interpretation and one group of people who, I agree with you, have very twisted minds and want to use religion for their purposes.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to apologize to Mr. Duncan for speaking out during his questioning of the witnesses. Let me say this, that I am also going to register my objections to the series of hearings that we've had. I failed to see the ultimate goal of the hearing. I find that they further create a stigmatizing and ostracizing of the community from whom we wish to get cooperation, whom we wish to get desired cooperation from. I was sitting here just thinking about this nation's history. And I remember when just in reading history, there was a huge, huge terrorist attack. It happened in Hawaii, in Pearl Harbor. And as a result of that, our nation reacted. And the way we reacted was to intern all Japanese Americans. There's a member of this body that actually grew up in an internment camp. And so I'm just concerned about unintended consequences. Be careful what you ask for. Be careful what you ask for. Our nation has a history that we don't like to connect oftentimes, but be careful what you ask for in America. I firmly believe that this hearing will foster misconceptions about hate and prejudice towards American Muslim community. All Americans deserve civil rights protections and the freedoms provided by the Constitution. The American Muslim and Arab American, South Asian American communities are a vital part of the solution to the problem of radicalization. And I think many of you have stated that. Terrorists do not radicalize entire communities. They recruit individuals. We need to improve communication and trust with Muslims in order to combat these recruiting tactics and mechanisms. If ultimately the goal of this hearing is to understand the Muslim American response, I think we need to identify the empirical research we've conducted in terms of canvassing America's very diverse Muslim community to determine what that so-called response should be. So I'd like to ask of our witnesses, what specific tools would you suggest are the best ways for us to get at a cooperative response that would move this nation forward, as opposed to the type of stigma, ostracizing, and provocative way that we've been going about it thus far?
If I may address that.
Generally, you... Well, any of them? Okay. Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. It's very important. And I would tell you that a lot of things are how they're presented. I think if these hearings are presented as against Islam, that's how they'll be interpreted. While if they're presented by, this is why it's so important to have Muslim witnesses, is that this is not against Islam. Many of us have had the greatest struggles in being expressed within the Muslim community, where we don't have this diverse discourse about the process of radicalization. Some of the tools, for example, we have a Muslim Liberty Project that advocates for youth that we have now in 12 different states that come together to learn about the founding fathers, that were able to separate church and state. And as much as I think we're teaching them to separate mosque and state, and that is the best way to counter-radicalize and inoculate them against radicalization, so that their identity can be tied to being American and never be separated as it was with Nidal Hassan and others. And I think one of the comments to say that somehow the government should never get into this separation between Islam and political Islam, I think is throwing up a white flag of surrender to a political ideology that attacks us. And it's very important to engage that community, and we have programs to do that.
Ms. Namani.
Thank you for your thoughtfulness on that question. And I do believe that one of the ways from a communication perspective that we need to move forward is that we recognize that there are these wounds inside of our Muslim community, just like there are in many minority communities, and yet then encourage the notion that this isn't a shaming process, that this isn't intended to shame the community or condemn Islam, but that, in fact, if we have honest, forthright conversations about extremist interpretation, it's to the benefit of the community also. And that's a tough conversation to have for any group.
Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you for your question. I think your question captured it perfectly. Having these hearings is not going to lead to the internment of Muslim Americans. It's exactly the lack of that kind of nuance, which I draw to your attention respectfully, madam, that can damage the outcome of what could be something so positive. It's the lack of nuance in our academic conversations, in our political conversations, in our media that's missing, and that has to be disabled. We need more complexity in the discussion.
Ms. Patel.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that the most important way for us to build the relationships between law enforcement and between Muslim Americans is to treat them as partners in the fight against terrorism and terrorists, rather than cast suspicion on them. Muslim Americans have come forward again and again. Sheriff Baca has testified before this very committee that they have come forward often, in difficult circumstances and at great personal cost to themselves, to give the police information that would allow them to foil terrorist plots.
I thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time expired. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Did Mr. Lundgren go? I was off key, Mr. Lundgren. I wanted to defer to, I know that you're accurate. Thank you very much for your courtesies. saw you sitting there and I came in. I thank you again. I thank the ranking member for his courtesies and to all the members that are here, and as well to the panel that is coming forward. My apologies for overlapping committees, and I'm delighted to have been able to come today. I think that the title of the hearing, The American Muslim Response to Hearings on Radicalization in Their Community, puts the witnesses in a very difficult posture. If I can recollect, there are millions of Muslims in the United States coming from any number of Muslim backgrounds, countries, and therefore it would be very difficult for me to perceive this hearing with all its good intentions of capturing the accuracy of Muslim positions here in the United States. I don't see a member of the Muslim student community as a witness, and I'm familiar with some episodes of infiltration of Muslim student organizations, as I recollect, in Ivy League settings, which I know parents send their children to school with the best hopes and dreams, and whether or not they would expect that they would have undercover operatives amongst those groups might be shocking. I also come to this issue with a sense of history of my own community, and recognizing the frustrations of certain attitudes and certain laws here in the United States of America. We can tout the civil rights era and the emotions of that era. Even our own colleague John Lewis speaks eloquently of that time, but we did not, as African Americans, have the full appreciation of our frustration and protests. Many of our leaders were under surveillance. One that we call the Dreamer was under surveillance. I know it firsthand as a member of the Select Committee on Assassinations, looking into the assassination of Dr. King and John F. Kennedy, and there was something called COINTEL that is now in the history books. It was a dastardly intrusion onto men and women who all they wanted was to be treated equally in this country. We now live in a different era, and that era, of course, deals with terrorism against our soil. And it heightens the if you will, credibility targeting groups because we don't want the heinous tragedy of 9/11 to occur. Let me put on the record that the world died on 9/11, the World Trade Center. And the numbers of people who were non-citizens, the numbers of people who were from different faith is enormous. I think that's the statement that should be made. And I want to make sure that we do not have another tragedy. That's why I believe this committee has one of the highest callings of the United States Congress to secure the homeland. But at the same time, I could sit uprightly in the Judiciary Committee and raise concerns about a provision or a law or amendments called FISA, because I think intrusions that take away our civil liberties is exactly what the terrorists want. I hold dear, and I held it up in several hearings, the Constitution. I hold it again. And frankly, until I can survey thousands of Muslims in mosques across America, in hospitals across America, on the front lines, formerly of Iraq and Afghanistan, wearing our uniform, I can't feel comfortable with the testimony today, though I thank the witnesses for their best efforts. I don't know what our hearings have done to the psychic of young Muslims in high schools and middle schools. I don't know whether it's increased the tensions or not. I certainly think we have a responsibility of oversight. So I'd simply say this, Ms. Patel, as I hold this Constitution up, can you answer from the Brennan Justice Center's perspective, very briefly, what core have we penetrated? What core constitutional rights have we pierced? And how we can do better?
Sorry, you mean through these hearings? Or just generally in the...
Generally, please.
Well, I mean, I think with Muslim Americans, the issues relate primarily to the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom to worship. There's a long line of Supreme Court cases that says that when government surveils places, they do impinge upon our right of free speech and our right to worship. And so when you are talking about surveillance in mosques, there is obviously a potential for that violation. There's also, when you talk about targeting a particular race, a particular ethnicity, or a particular religion, you obviously have equal protection issues that come up in that situation. I think those are the two main areas. Those are certainly the areas that have been raised in the NYPD lawsuit that was mentioned by Chairman King earlier.
I want to thank the chairman for his indulgence. My time is out, and I just simply want to say that as a Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Chairman, I want us to focus on intelligence and behavior, and I want us to hold dear the Constitution. As you recall, we all said after 9/11, we will fight the terrorists, but we will not destroy this valuable and wonderful and precious source of equality and justice and freedom for anyone in our nation. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and that's what I've tried to do as chairman. With that, we now recognize the former member of the committee, Mr. Green from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and the ranking member for the preeminent privilege of being here today as an interloper. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Isn't it wonderful that the grandson of a Christian minister can sit on the Homeland Security Committee and say, Assalamu alaikum. Dear brothers and sisters, and I say it because I believe there's just one race, and that's the human race. I think we're all related. And if we're not brothers and sisters, we're probably cousins. So, cousins. Thank you all for appearing today. We've had some discussion about radicalization of religions. Radicalization of religions. If you agree that radicalization exists within all religions to some extent, would you kindly extend a hand into the air? I'd like to make a record. Let me just keep your hand up for just a second. I'm sorry. Okay, let the record reflect that all of the hands were raised. I want to get to the gravamen of the issue, the thing that causes the consternation among many persons on this committee. And that is, by the way, we all love the country. We all love the First Amendment. We all love the first of the first, which is freedom of religion. We all do. No one on either side loves it anymore, in my opinion. So let's get to the heart of what's going on. I don't think that most people oppose hearings on radicalization. I do not, N-O-T, I do not oppose hearings on radicalization. I do oppose hearings that don't focus on the entirety of radicalization. And if you agree that we have Christians, as has been mentioned by more than one member, Christians who become radicalized, they become a part of Islam and they become radicalized, as it's being said, why not have a hearing on the radicalization of Christians? Don't you marvel at how a person born in this country, born into Christianity, can become radicalized? Isn't there any curiosity as to what happens to cause a person who is born into Christianity to become a radical? There's just more to it than simply saying the radicalization of Islam or Islamism. What happened to cause a woman who, you've all heard of G.I. Jane, correct? What happened? What happened to this woman, blue eyes, blonde hair, born in the United States of America? How did she get radicalized? Why is it that we won't have hearings on the totality of radicalization. And why don't we ask ourselves, how is it that this is happening to American citizens? I'm not opposed to the hearings. I just want to be fair. I want to be fair to Muslims. I want to be fair to people who practice Islam. And to be fair, you have to go beyond just the radicalization of Islam. And that's what we are not doing. And I do think that it is a problem of perception. People who see the hearings and never hear about the hearing on the radicalization of Christianity have to ask themselves, why is this missing? Why don't we go to the next step and ask, how is it that a blue-eyed, blonde-haired, white female in the United States of America can become radicalized into a point of wanting to do harm to this country? We don't have that type of hearing. That's the problem, and that's why people express this trepidation. And I would just close with this. I'm not Muslim, but apparently I look like I am. Because I've had people to shout some very ugly things to me and associate me with Islam. I don't know what it feels like to be Muslim, but I do know what it feels like to look like a Muslim in the minds of some people and to be demeaned in a public venue. So I thank you for your appearances today, and I look forward to the day that we'll have that hearing that deals with the radicalization of Christians in America.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Does the gentleman from Mississippi seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman is recognized.
Dr. Jasser, when Mr. Congressman Richmond referenced credentials, you made reference to a top secret clearance. And I want to make sure that we have it in the record. We checked it. We don't have an indication of that top secret clearance. Can you provide it for the record of this committee?
Yeah, I was appointed to a commission earlier this year, and I had been vetted through a clearance process for that, so I could provide that, but it wasn't asked of me for this hearing.
Yeah. So your testimony is that vetting gives you top secret clearance.
That's what I was told, sir.
Okay. Well, if you will just provide it for the record of this hearing,
yes,
we appreciate it. Ms. Namani, you referenced serving as a trainer for the Department of Defense. Am I correct?
That's right, sir.
Well, I want to make sure that our record is correct also. Your truth and testimony does not indicate that you've worked in that capacity. Can you make that amendment to that testimony so our record is complete?
Sure. I don't work as an employee to the Department of Defense.
Well, you have a contract?
Right, but not to the Department of Defense.
So as a trainer, who are you training?
For students are Department of Defense employees, but I'll provide you the full details as you need them.
Wait now, are these just students, or are you doing this for the Department of Defense?
Well, I call them students, but they're either soldiers that are deploying or individuals that are doing work on the Afghanistan-Pakistan region here in the U.S.
Yeah, but who employed you to do that?
I work through a consultant company.
So that works for the Department of Defense?
Exactly, right.
Well, we just want to make sure the record, because you didn't say that.
Sure.
All right, please provide us in your truth and testimony statement.
No problem.
I yield back.
I want to thank all the witnesses today for their valuable testimony. The members of the committee may have some additional questions, and we'll ask all of you to respond to those questions in writing. If you should get them, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. And without objection, the committee stands adjourned.